Again, my name is Carl Johnson, and I am running for State Senate District N. I always like to remind folks, and after being reminded myself several times, that I needed to remind folks where the heck District N is. So it comprises of House District 28, which is Baxter to Bar, southeast of the Molden Curve, stuck again, and then District 28, which is South Hillside, and then the Turning Iron community is Indian Bird down to Girdwood. And I'd like to introduce, just to a quick introduction of who we are, who we have on our panel tonight, and then they're going to tell a little bit more about themselves when we get to them in the introductory remarks. First, we've got Cliff Groh, who is basically one of the people who laid the foundation for the permanent fund, that permanent fund that everybody talks about all the time. He's also on the board of directors for Alyeska Common Ground. Then we have Ian Laing, who's the executive director for the Institute of the North. And then Ky Holland, who, in many ways, kind of a multitasking advocate for innovating our economy, is also a partner with Alyeska Management, LLC, Venture Management, LLC. And that's kind of the quick intro. And then I'm just going to kind of lay sort of a foundation for what it is we're talking about tonight. And they will each kind of bring their own pieces into this discussion as we get through it. And then at about, let's say about 6:30 or so, then we will go to Q&A. We do have some questions that have already been submitted in advance as part of the registration process. You can also ask questions in the chat if you're on Zoom. And then for the folks who are just joining us via Facebook Live, you can put some comments in the discussion there if you want to ask a question or just add a comment to the discussion. But that's how we will do the Q&A. So speaking of discussion, during this campaign cycle, there have been a lot of questions, a lot of candidates talking about how much they're going to cut from our state budget, what they're going to cut. Although actually none of them actually said what they're going to cut, just how much, kind of arbitrarily. And then, of course, there's been a lot of the only revenue discussion really has been whether or not we should pass ballot measure 1. What tonight is about is the things that we really haven't been talking about. We haven't talked much about what the state of our economy is, and between the economy we have, the economy we could have, and revenue. Most of, again, our economic discussions focus on the oil industry and what it does or does not do for our economy and revenue. Historically, oil has played a huge role in both our economy and revenue. But what more could we do with a more innovative and diverse economy as far as boosting state revenue? And also, how would that intersect with the growth of our permanent fund and its stability and sustainability over a long period of time? But I'm a numbers guy. So I'm just going to kind of throw out some numbers of where we're at and to lay the foundation for how this intersects with what Cliff and Ian and Ky will have to say. So spending has been flat at about $4.5 billion for the last 4 years. But over the last 8 years, so we did some big steep cuts at first. We've cut about 50% out of our state revenue. That's public safety, roads, runways, schools, healthcare, all kinds of things. For fiscal year 22, next year's revenue projections put us at about $3 billion from the permanent funds earning reserve and about $1 billion from oil revenue. That's at our current taxation structure. And according to the Institute of Social and Economic Research, talking about budget and what budget cut consequences are, generally, when we cut about $100 million in budget, that leads to about 1,000 private and public sector jobs lost. So when we're talking about cutting, that's one of the things to think about as we look to the future, how much we're cutting, where we're cutting, and what the impacts are on an economy that's still in a recession. All right, next, permanent fund. Total value right now is about $66 billion, which includes $55 billion in the corpus of the fund and then $11 billion in the earnings reserve. Now for fiscal year 22, there's going to be about $5.5 billion left in the earnings reserve after the POMV, that's percent over market value draw, and what we have to set aside is $1.7 billion earnings that cannot be spent. So to frame that, where along with the budget, if we paid a $1,000 permanent fund dividend next year, that would leave us with about a $500 million deficit. And that's also including more cuts to get to that point. Finally, the cost, there's been a lot of discussion when we're talking about what's been going on in this campaign and the permanent fund dividend, been a lot of discussion about offering a full payback of the PFD plus a full statutory PFD next year. Now, remember earlier I said after obligations, we have about $5.5 billion left in the earnings reserve. That campaign promise of a full payback plus a full statutory PFD will cost about $6.7 billion. So where does that money come from? Economy. Right now, there's a whole bunch of different places out there that claim different numbers related to share of the GDP, percentage of employment. I heard wild numbers today on the employment from oil ranging from 10,000 to 75,000. But right now we are, according to the Energy Information Administration, we have the second highest output of crude oil production of any state in the U.S. It's about 20% of our economy, but also 20% of our economy is state and federal government. Tourism, which I play a role in, comes in at about 11.4% of our GDP. And when you look at a per capita ratio, we have the fourth highest GDP in the US. We're 48th in raw numbers, but fourth highest in per capita. Revenue options. I know the Walker administration looked at both an income tax and a sales tax. I believe the income tax number they came up with, I think it was 1/6 of a federal tax return, would generate about $750 million. And then a sales tax at 3% would generate $400 million, but it would more disproportionately impact lower income residents as well as communities under 100 people unless we had offsets for certain types of services and goods. Anyway, so that's my quick overview of numbers and things just kind of throw out there and gestate in the back of your brain while we talk more tangible things with our panelists. And I'm just going to go in the order that I introduced everyone. We'll start with Cliff for his kind of opening remarks and his background and his thoughts on how that all ties in with both our economic and revenue picture for Alaska.
Thank you very much, Carl. As I said before, thank you for running, and I appreciate your grasp and a clear grasp of the issues and the difficult position that Alaska is in. I think there's some things that people need to particularly understand about our fiscal situation, which I've worked on, I'm embarrassed to admit, a long time, 4 decades, is starting from the early 80s when I helped create the permanent fund dividend. I appreciate people's comments about the permanent fund. My only role in creating the permanent fund was to vote for it, like tens of thousands of Alaskans. But I did play a very major role in the legislative staff in creating the permanent fund dividend, and also, for full disclosure, was special assistant to the Commissioner of Revenue when a substantial oil tax increase was adopted in 1989, the ELF tax revision of the production and severance tax, one of a number of oil tax changes that have occurred in the history of our state. Additionally, I have been a board member for more than 20 years of Alaska Common Ground, and was chair for 4 years up until 2 years ago. I'm now writing, I'm so interested in this topic that I've spent much of the last 2 months putting together a book or booklet in graphic form on the Alaska's fiscal crisis and the actual options for dealing with it. And for those of you who have actually seen me try to draw, I got an editorial cartoonist to help me, Peter Dunlap-Scholl, as well as a couple of people who are very good with Excel graphs. So in terms of where we are, our backs are against the wall in the sense that we have spent billions and billions of dollars in savings, and with as I told a reporter earlier today, our fiscal system is broken in the sense that the one we had for years, for decades, relied on having large amounts of new oil money come in each year. With a long-term decline in Alaska oil production, we only have about a quarter of the oil going through the pipeline that we did in the late 80s. And obviously the very bumpy ride with oil prices, which are very substantially below what they were in recent years, especially 8 or 10 years ago. And they obviously, on top of that, the whole COVID-19 pandemic has additionally both very substantially reduced demand, even create a few problems with supply, but mostly it looks like it's going to have a long run downward effect on demand. So you add that all up, Alaska has now changed its way of financing itself. More than 2/3 of the money, actually more than 70% of the money in the budget this year is coming from the use of the percent of market value system through the permanent fund. We're spending permanent fund earnings, and we're still way short even after cutting the budget substantially over the last 7 or 8 years. And all the other old tricks we've used for years are not going to work. Oil prices would need to almost double off their current levels to save us, and that this very much does not seem likely to occur. Oil production has fallen for a very long time and will never get back even to a million barrels a day. And the idea of the gas line, which was so prominent some years ago in Alaska, just seems more and more like a fantasy. So the people of Alaska have also need to recognize that the easy budget cuts have happened. When we say that there's a $4.5 billion budget, that's sort of conventional public services. Total spending in the unrestricted general fund this year would be about $5.2 billion. If you paid all the back dividends, that's, that would be well over $6 billion. So we way over the current budget if you paid the back dividends and paid out a current year dividend under the statutory formula that I helped create. I think that when you add all this up, you come to the conclusion that our state needs new revenues, perhaps in the form of what I would prefer is an income tax, a graduated progressive income tax like Alaska had and used to finance about half of its budget for many years between 1949 and 1980 when it was repealed, when the big oil money started coming in. We have to look seriously at raising oil taxes, perhaps not as much as would be called for under ballot measure 1, but maybe in the order of 200 or 400 million that could come in there through that. And I also believe that we need to have a new and sustainable permanent dividend formula. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this, and I think that Alaskans really need to focus on this, our grave problem that dominates everything else. Alaska has, I think, by far the worst fiscal crisis of any state, and it's complicated that we also have the most complex fiscal politics of any state because we keep the permanent fund dividend and oil tax. Thanks a lot, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak and answer questions.
Thank you, Cliff. You said something that I'm going to want to follow up on when we get into discussion. I've highlighted it so I can remember that. Next, we're going to move on to Ian Laing, who is the executive director for Institute of the North, and I want to illustrate just kind of how small town Anchorage really is. Ian called me out of the blue one day because one of my campaign volunteers had lit dropped at his house. He lives in the district. He called me up. We had a good long discussion. He asked me some hard questions about budget, policy, permanent fund, all kinds of things. So one thing led to another, and I invited him to join us tonight because I thought that he would bring a really interesting perspective to this. So Ian, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Thanks a lot, Carl. Can you hear me all right?
All good.
Yeah, okay. Good. Well, yeah, I'll say first that, Carl, although our relationship is new, you're the kind of candidate that I'm really excited about because for being sort of a younger guy in this conversation, I've been thinking about it and sort of obsessing over it for quite a while. And it's really refreshing to talk to a candidate who understands the issues and isn't just spitting out a bunch of platitudes to make me feel good about a situation, which quite honestly is just, there's no comforting sort of outcome to this really, because all of the solutions that we've talked about, like Cliff went over, are they all have a cost to us economically, but then you've got to compare that, of course, to the status quo. I started out, I guess, in this discussion as a legislative staffer, much like Cliff. Actually, we had the same job at DOR at different points in our career, and it was sort of during this period that I wrapped my head around the way that things work. And when you think about the way that this state has done its budget for years, just sort of, we think we're going to have this amount of money next year, let's spend that. It's kind of crazy. And, you know, there's a lot of people in the conversation that have said, you know, we need a plan, just provide us some certainty around what the future looks like. How are we going to pay our bills? And, you know, the pipers come due. So I was just watching some videos that I had made with a group called Our Alaska, which was involved several years ago. And there was a little snippet from David Teal, who's just the retired legislative director or legislative finance director, where he was saying our reserves are projected to run out in 2020. Well, that was 4 years ago. Here we are in 2020. Reserves have run out. That group that we had made those videos with, Our Alaska, was kind of a fun little, that was my first involvement publicly on this issue. We raised $30,000 through Kickstarter. I think probably did the first publicly funded communications campaign, trying to get younger people interested in this issue because it's pretty dry and hard to get outside the sort of the policy wonk bubble. But I went on from there to run a separate campaign. It was the largest of the statewide campaigns focused on getting a sustainable fiscal plan in place. It was called Alaska's Future. And in addition to all the efforts that Cliff and others have been engaged with, I think was partially responsible for the adoption of the statutory percent of market value formula, which went into place a few years ago. So like you said, I'm the Institute of the Institute of the North director now, and we are just launching an effort. We sent out an email today announcing a program that we're putting together for second week of November, 9th through the 13th. And we're just looking at one small slice of this, right? Of course, any plan is going to include a reduction of services, some sort of broad-based revenue, conversation around dividends, probably oil taxes. Rather than take all of that on, we're just focused right now on the sort of collateral risk posed to the permanent fund in that, well, actually to back up, one of the things about a plan that kind of gets overlooked a lot of the time is you've got the revenue, you've got the spending side, there's also timing. And that factors into this in a lot of ways, because whenever you talk about revenue measures, those take a while to put in place. And meanwhile, you're spending down savings. The impact of that is that we're just about to do something that we've never done before in the history of the state, which is to start spending down the permanent fund beyond what is sustainable. You know, we accepted when we went to this deficit several years ago that we're going to start to use the fund for government services. And we have been doing that, but now that we have exhausted every other pool of money, the only place to go for that is the earnings reserve account. And the reason that the Institute is getting involved in that particular discussion is that when you talk about any form of revenue, spending cuts, you can have all kinds of philosophical or economic arguments about those different solutions. But when we spend down the permanent fund, there's a very particular philosophical argument in that of all the injustices that we might do ourselves in trying to solve this situation, that, at least to me, is one of the most egregious in that we've got this vessel, the permanent fund, where we are converting these non-renewable resources into renewable wealth for all Alaskans in perpetuity, generations yet to come. We save a very small amount of our revenue in the permanent fund, and to spend that down just because we have access to it is, it's just wrong, period. So we're trying to get a conversation started around how we might better approach our policies around permanent fund utilization to better fit our current situation. Anyways, I can ramble on this about this stuff forever, so I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you, Ian. Again, you said something that triggered something I'll want to follow up on. Now we'll move on to Ky Holland, who has a presentation, kind of sort of his mission in life, promoting the notion that there are so many ways that we can innovate our economy that is can provide for sustainable industries that are not necessarily based on just natural resources. So I want to pass this on to Ky.
Great, thanks. And I'm assuming the presentation's coming up okay for you to be able to see. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and join with you in this discussion. I've enjoyed getting to know Carl, and I'm really actually, as I go into this election cycle for the state, actually excited to see some of the candidates like Carl that are coming into this discussion and helping us look forward in terms of the directions and the options that we have. I have a background in economic development and innovation commercialization. Most recently been at the University of Alaska Fairbanks as the chief technology commercialization officer, and now taking a sabbatical. I continue to work with Alyeska Venture Management, which is Alaska's first seed fund for investing in startup businesses. That fund is currently fully deployed, but we're still managing our portfolio of businesses. I'm an angel investor involved with the community council and all things that really look ahead to the future. And that's really what I want to share a couple thoughts about. There's a lot of focus that's going to be put on kind of trying to figure out how we get through the day, and that's important. But I'm afraid that our success is in looking ahead to creating the Alaska that we want for the future, for our kids and for generations to come, particularly as it relates to Ian's comments and others about trying to create a fiscally sustainable future that actually leverages what we've done in the past to create what we can have in the future. And so I'd like to cover a few thoughts along that way. One of the things that I think is always surprising for people, and this is true both in Alaska but across the country, is to realize how important entrepreneurship is to our economy. This report put together by the Center for Economic Development on the state of entrepreneurship, look very deeply at this activity in Alaska and found out here that firms that were 5 years or younger accounted for 89% of Alaska's net employment growth, and consistently adding 4,000 to 6,000 jobs to the economy each year. We've created more jobs through entrepreneurship than we've lost in oil and gas, and yet our focus has been on those jobs lost in oil and gas, with scarcely any attention to the work that could be done to help build up new jobs, new businesses, and our future economy. Our future economy is an interesting discussion. All economies go through changes. We no longer drive horses to get to work. We no longer have to walk. We no longer an agrarian society. And so things change, and so Alaska will change. We might imagine saying that we have had a series of economic cycles that right now I would argue we're in the tail end of our 2.0 cycle. That is a colonial natural resource development cycle. It's been good for Alaska. It's been good for many of us, but it is mature. We're not seeing major growth. If a mine opens, a mine closes. If an oil field is mostly depleted, another one is coming on. And so we're stirring that business. As Cliff mentioned, we don't see any expectation that we're going to fill the pipeline back up to 2 million barrels of oil per day. We're going to be lucky to just kind of keep it in those 500,000-600,000 barrel type numbers. It will maintain it. We'll do well. We need to build off of that, though. And the focus I have is building our future on what I refer to as Alaska 3.0. That is looking ahead to a value-added economy that builds off of the legacy that we have, that creates a sustainable global economy. To do that, and these are some of the challenges now that Carl has, is that there's a really important symbiotic relationship between the civic economy that does things that are valuable but not profitable, and the market economy that does things that are valuable and profitable. And they have to work together. This issue about taxation on oil and gas industry and about killing the golden goose, we all know, and I know Carl understands this, these things have to be done working, together. We cannot kill the market economy, the oil and gas business, in favor of short-term trying to save our civic economy, our university, our schools. They work together, they're necessary. The civic economy brings to the market economy roads, schools, employable people, healthy people, and so on. So our challenge is in creating collaborative, innovative activities that bring these together, that look at how do we strengthen the existing economy players that are there, and how do we use that as a springboard to innovators and entrepreneurs that can move us ahead. We actually have a very robust, really amazing innovation ecosystem in Alaska. And I want to bring more visibility and encourage Carl and other folks in Juneau to understand this and to support this and help us build this. We have brain power through a series of programs, both at the universities as well as other private, public, and educational programs. We have innovation and entrepreneurship programs, from incubators and accelerators to business plan competitions to angel capital competitions. We have quality places for this work to be done, whether it's the Anchorage Seed Lab, makerspaces, boardrooms, the libraries, the Energy Center, and so on. And we have an emerging new narrative that talks about what we can be in the future that builds upon the economy we've had and the economy and the communities we want to build. So what does this mean? Alaska's next economy will build onto today's economy. We're already starting to do this. We need to embrace it and accelerate it. Oil companies have announced globally that they are moving away from being focused purely on oil and gas, and they're becoming energy companies. We cannot stay thinking in the past that our oil economy is what we're standing on. We have Launch Alaska here, which is an accelerator company that's bringing in folks from around the world, as well as bringing up companies in Alaska to develop the future of energy and the revolution that is taking place on helping move diesel out of rural communities, so on. We have Alaskan Ocean Cluster. It's amazing. You go to Iceland and they catch a cod and they cut off the fillet, and what's left in Iceland is more valuable than the fillet. Here in Alaska, we catch a salmon or a cod, we whack off the fillet, and we throw the rest away. There's an amazing value-added opportunities there. The Spruce Root is doing this same kind of work in tourism. The Nature Conservancy is doing really interesting work in forestry. The Health Tie, that's the test bed for innovation entrepreneurship, is doing the same in healthcare and health tech innovations. We have kind of a three-legged stool to look at down the road that I think brings in new businesses, new jobs, new revenue for the state, which looks at digital transformation capacity for existing businesses. It looks at innovation challenges to solve and take our challenges like erosion along riverbanks and turns them into new ventures and solutions that we can export. And we need to have the entrepreneurial capacity to do that. We are doing this. This is not a pipe dream. This is not what we could be doing. This is what we are doing. We now need to accelerate this at this point. We have companies like Heather's Choice, which is doing adventure backpacking food. It's sold around the world. They're having their best year yet at this point in the middle of this pandemic. 60 Hertz is doing amazing. They have taken rural maintenance and turned it into a global business for providing maintenance resources for isolated microgrid systems. We have Luma Watercraft that's building swiftwater rescue craft that is being sold throughout the country to the government and rescue squads that started putting boats on the Connect River and figured out that that turned out to be a great solution for FEMA and Homeland Security. Alpine Fit doing base layer clothing, North Arrow providing innovative new pad systems for the North Slope. This is our next economy. This is our future. We need to shift our thinking into looking into the future and adopting the public policies that create a new level of energy and support where the civic economy provides the underlying catalyst for this activity to happen. There's some resources here that I can share later if you're interested, but these are public policy centers that are recognizing that America's future and Alaska's future is in entrepreneurship and innovation. And I believe that is where we will build the economy that can support the public services and the civic economy that we need. So I appreciate the time to share this and look forward to your questions.
That's fantastic, Ky. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to do a couple of follow-up comments of observations from each of the three panelists, and we're just going to jump into the Q&A because we're going to have some really great questions. And I'm going to go in reverse order on, what you're saying, Ky, about the value added with the seafood industry. My wife and I were in Norway last year, and we were on the Lofoten Islands right in the middle of their winter cod fishery. And there were huge fish racks that had nothing on them but fish heads. Not fillets, fish heads. And they had this long-standing, like dozens, if not hundreds of years trade with Nigeria to sell them fish heads that were then dried, and they were already dried, but they were ground up into a protein meal that was used as a food additive. I'll agree with you too. One of your things about tourism, cultural tourism is rising about 14% annually. And that gives us a unique opportunity in Alaska, not only for statewide economic opportunity, but year-round economic opportunity. That is something that doesn't require water, snow, sunshine, any conditions other than the people and where they live and how they live. Spending it down is just wrong. What you were talking about, Ian, with spending down an earnings reserve. I'll note that ICER indicates that for about every 100 million we spend in the earnings reserve, we lose about 10 million annually in compounded interest. So if you're looking at long-term impacts, the loss of interest alone, in addition to the spending down in the earnings reserve, is a negative impact. And then lastly, back to Cliff on a comment you made about the gas pipeline being a fantasy. And I agree with that just because the economics aren't there. I've spoken to some folks who indicate that for every 100 miles of pipeline you build, you have to add about $1 per cubic foot of what you have to sell at market in order to make it viable. So that's adding $8 per cubic foot of natural gas for a price you have to sell at market in order to recover the costs of 800-mile pipeline. What I see as promising is the Killick LNG project, which would provide for direct sale of our 35 trillion cubic feet of stranded natural gas on the North Slope to Pacific Rim markets. And I think even better than that, a short pipeline, maybe 10 miles worth of pipeline with a terminal facility set up, would make that more accessible to a variety of different wholesale consumers. Anyway, so on to questions. I'm going to first start with the questions that are in the chat, and then I'll go to the questions that we've received via email as part of the registration. So first question is there a way to tax the air freight industry which takes advantage of Alaska's unique geographic location, or would this be prohibited under interstate commerce law? My law school rememberings of Con Law 101 and what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause makes me wonder whether or not that would be viable, because the Dormant Commerce Clause says, yes, even though if you're taxing activity solely within your state, if it has an aggregate impact on interstate commerce, that may be prohibited under the Constitution and the Congress's sole authority to regulate interstate commerce. So that's regulating interstate commerce. That's not the same as taxing it. So that's a question I really don't know the answer to. I'm sure there are a variety of fees that could be assessed that say help pay for facilities related to aircraft coming through, but I'm not sure if anybody has any ideas on answer to that question. If not, that's one I will put on my list of things to look up and inquire about. I'll just kind of leave it open to the panel at this point.
This is Ky. Just offer that, the landing fees and other revenue that's collected from the servicing of the planes, as well as the fueling of the planes, is already an important part of our local economy. The fact that other work going on with the new freight building that is being built right now will create additional jobs and activities in that area that both will directly service the planes, but also provide more opportunities for value-added activities is another opportunity. We continue to have a trade-free zone designation for the airport that allows stuff to come in, get moved around, and then ship back out again. that provide more opportunities for some limited value add. So there are ways of being able to benefit from that, but I would defer to you and others that would dig deeper into how any taxes might be levied on that, because I'm not unsure of that aspect of it, but there's certainly value added revenue opportunities. And if we had an income tax and other ways of capturing some of the activity, we would see some benefit.
Anyone else with thoughts? If not, I can move on. But Ian, it seems like you have something.
Oh, yeah, only a caution in that in this conversation, I think there's a lot of there's sort of a propensity towards what I would call distraction, just the nickel and dime stuff. You know, can we tax this little thing or that little thing? And I'm not trying to take away from the question, but given how much time we have to really put something sustainable in place and the scale of the different levers, it's important to focus on the ones that can really make a difference. And we spent a lot of time talking about just, I mean, as a state, talking about little things, sort of like pocket change, compared to what we really need to be focused on in order to solve this problem.
And I'll add too, we have a significant restriction on how much time we have to solve the problem, not only fiscally, you know, looking at where we're at fiscally in the next couple of years as far as revenue and spending and all that, but COVID-19. Now, we only had a 75-day session this year because of COVID-19, and speaking to sitting legislators and what they expect to see in the next session, they expect an even shorter session than that. So we don't have a lot of time to make changes, and we do have to make significant changes. So I agree with that point that, you know, somebody once suggested to me, well, you can look at indirect expenditures as a way of shaving out some pocket change or couch change, as they put it. But in all reality, we're long past the point of nitpicking at our budget, and we really are, just because we're both simultaneously in an emergency room situation, if we want to pull a healthcare analogy, and also recovery from surgery. So we need to plan for both at the same time. How are we going to triage, but then how are we going to recover? And we have to do it in the same compressed amount of time. This question is kind of more big picture. Does growing the state's economy significantly benefit the state financially in ways other than an income tax, i.e., is the corporate income tax significant to solving our budget problems?
You're referencing the old Alaska disconnect, right? The concept that Scott Goldsmith at ICER came up with, which is that because there is no broad-based tax in Alaska, their economic development doesn't pay its own way. It creates costs for the government that are not repaid. And a lot of industrial development in Alaska falls in that category. And then Alaska needs a broad-based tax. Obviously, a sales tax is regressive and has particular problems in Alaska, given both the small communities problem that you mentioned, Carl, of that are in the bush, but also the fact that local governments, sales tax is traditionally reserved for local governments. And so you could create a giant double taxation, big two-layer problem in some communities like, you know, Wrangell or Petersburg or Sitka and others. But you need a broad-based tax, of which an income tax is the most efficient, to capture the revenues for the state government from, you know, your economy growing. I mean, you know, there are other ways, but that would be the probably the most efficient way. And we've been on this big holiday for years, and now we have to sort of grow up. I mean, to move away from your healthcare analogy and sort of a more of a, you know, development of a human way of looking at it. Alaska needs to face that we can't, the world we had before no longer exists, and we can't sustain it. We have to move to a more sustainable system.
Cliff, do you happen to know what corporate income taxes are these days?
Not a lot. I don't remember exactly. Not even. Yeah, it's a relatively small amount.
Yeah,
it's not much compared to the scale, like you said, Ian.
Well, if anybody does, go ahead.
I just wanted to offer, one of the pieces of this, and I don't want to get too far off into the macroeconomic perspective of this, but there's three kinds of flows of money in an economy. There's the good flows, that is money coming in because we've done something value added here, we export it and money comes in. And obviously oil is one of the ways that money comes in. There's neutral money, which is what we kind of stir around in our economy. I get a paycheck, I go down to a local restaurant and have a meal, I go to a local grocery store, and the money just kind of moves around in the economy. And that's good money, but it's stirring around. And there's bad money, which is what flows out of the state, that goes away, the profits out there. So economic development, in my mind, can be kind of broken up into a couple different big buckets that kind of relate to this question. And one of the buckets, of course, it's easy to immediately grab onto is how does this new economic activity create the revenue we need at the state level for taxes for schools, university, for roads and whatnot. And with some sort of broad-based tax, as well as I think revamping the corporate taxes, there's a way to capture some more. For example, if you have an LLC business in the state, your LLC business doesn't pay any taxes, because as employees and personal income, we don't pay any personal income tax in the state, and an LLC corporation doesn't pay any taxes at all. And that's why the Hill Corp deal is such a head scratcher, because we're going from a C Corp, whereas an Alaskan, I get to be a partial owner of BP Corporation when they own those assets. So as much as they're still kind of a foreign company, as an Alaskan, I can own part of those production resources. That's okay. And that C Corp pays corporate taxes to the state of Alaska, $50 million a year. Hill Corp buys a business. I, as an Alaskan, lose my shareholder right to be able to own a part of the Alaskan production assets. And that LLC passes all of its money directly on to its Texas owners, completely bypassing Alaska. So there's just some structural issues here. And to Cliff's point about the economic disconnect, in most states, the way the system kind of works is if you have lots of great jobs and you're helping people make more money and they're doing well, they pay a little more in state income tax. And that state income tax pays for your schools and your vocational education, your universities. So that you get more employees that can make more money. And so they go out and pay more taxes. There's a healthy, positive ecosystem where things feed in a positive, virtuous way. We're missing those virtuous connections where if we lift up Alaskans, they lift the state up in turn so that we all can win in that area. But that's the economic side. The other side, again, is to the degree that our economic focus is in creating more exports, so we bring more good money in. We create a higher velocity of local business where we're doing more business with each other because we have more money to spend internally, and we do it with each other because we have more businesses we want. And we develop the businesses to create import substitutions, so we no longer have to send our money out to Florida for distance education. Explain that to me, why the state of Alaska doesn't have the resources to be able to provide the distance education support that we need. We have to go to Florida for that. That just drives me nuts. Another contract Department of Transportation had is having folks in Florida call me up as a contractor to check and verify their state of Alaska database of contractors. So we need to put a plug in some of those holes in our economy. So anyway, I'll jump off my soapbox for a moment. I'm sure you got more questions.
That's fine, Ky. Thank you for that. The next two questions are income tax related. And I think we'll need to keep our discussion on them pretty brief. Can we establish a principle that those who come to Alaska to earn money from our resources, i.e. North Slope workers, out-of-state fishermen, mining companies, tourism companies, should pay something to support the state above and beyond ordinary corporate income tax? The numbers I've heard is that roughly 20.7% of workers who earn an income in Alaska are non-resident, and that roughly $2 billion in income earned annually on the North Slope alone leaves the state. So I'll frame that for answering this question. Anybody feel free to jump in.
I think this one's easy, just a big heck yes. Remember, I had to get this out of my system before it went live, so I have to leave it at that.
I agree. And some of the non-resident workers are high income, not all of them, but some of them are high. There's increasingly becoming a phenomenon of doctors and dentists flying in from the lower 48 to work here. I personally fired my former dentist when I found out that he lived in Utah and came up here for 34 weeks a year for 4 days a week and said, well, thanks anyway. I'm sure you're a great family man back in Utah, but this is not the way I want to see our economy work. I also want to say there are some high income people in Alaska among some non-residents, but also some residents. I've personally had coffee with a surgeon who made $5.5 million in net income in 1 year in Alaska. It particularly made me unhappy when I found out that he had almost quadrupled his income by moving to Alaska and dramatically cutting his workload. But there are some high income earners in Alaska, and despite what some people may have told you.
What else? Okay, so I briefly mentioned at the beginning of this kind of one estimate on what generally a generic income tax could bring in, but how much revenue do you think a progressive personal income tax could add to Alaska's budget? And then is there a connection between that and how many jobs that such a tax might create? And what would it take to implement?
Well, it depends on the details, right? But it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere between $400 and $700 million, depending on the rate, depending on exemptions. And I think it takes about 1.5 years minimum to stand something like that up.
I agree.
No more.
I agree on the timing. It's probably in the order of 18 months to stand it up, as Ian said. What that practically means is if you adopt an income tax in 2021, you probably don't see revenues until 2023. It's a practical matter because of that timing lag. I would also say that even a $700 million a year revenue increase from an income tax would still leave Alaskans' total tax burden the second lowest in the United States. So there may be more, you might be able to raise some more revenues from an income tax. Like I said, $700 million would not be a giant hit compared to what other states take in taxes.
Just want to throw out a thought on this one. It's kind of indirect, but I think there's a real challenge with the lag of the income tax that I think is valid, and there's a lot of issues there. But one of the things I want to suggest that we be careful of, because that lag and some of the challenges there might cause people to shift back over to a sales tax focus in terms of a driving one. And I really have personally found that the ability to keep the sales tax as a local tax option for local jurisdictions, Palmer, Wasilla, Kenai, to be able to have that and to keep the state out of that area is really vital. And I think it's just going to be important for us to keep track of creating a healthy combination of taxes that work together in harmony between local jurisdictions, the state jurisdiction, so we don't start stepping on each other, because it'd be really easy for the state to get excited and think, oh, well, maybe we can turn the sales tax on faster and get a bunch of revenue. But then we're going to take local jurisdictions that have depended upon sales taxes, and we're going to screw them. And it's just really important that we find the balance. And I think folks like Carl are going to have a real tough job doing that, but that's the tough job that needs to be done.
State sales tax probably already takes, it also probably takes about 18 months to put together too, because the state has never had one. So they're probably about similar in their original startup phases.
And it's worth noting the revenue potential there is a lot lower than an income tax too. More like 300 million.
Just two more questions. Let's try to respond to the first one quickly. and I'm definitely gonna, I want to bring this, make sure we talked about this because we actually talked about it before we went live. That is, what do you think of Commonwealth North's new online interactive state budget tool? Have you tried it out yet?
Oh, I've been on it. I've run through it. I'll be blunt, I was surprised and disappointed to see that it does not include the measure one as an option. So it leaves the result that you get from running the tool, I think, incomplete without being able to consider that option in there. That being said, I like the way the tool was set up. I would encourage everybody to play around with it to see what the choices are and to see how hard they are.
I just offer that that was maybe a questionable decision whether to include or exclude that particular component, but both and I were involved in the development of that in different slices of that larger tool. And I can say it was a pretty collaborative and open process, and setting aside the judgments around Prop 1, I like it. I think anything out there that gets new people engaged in this issue and thinking about the tough decisions that we have ahead is net positive.
I agree. People should try it. It's better than nothing, and
Yeah.
it advances understanding to just look at it.
The piece, Carl, that I would suggest that we really need to noodle through, and I'd be curious if you have a thought on this, and I know you're trying to move us along, but we went through this exercise, what, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, where we had 3 good tools out there. The governor had a tool, I think ICER had a tool, and somebody else had a tool. We did a bunch of this. Remember, had the things on the stage too, where you could move the blocks around, do the big teeter-totter on the stage and whatnot.
Yeah, I made that.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important question to noodle through here, which is, this tool is great, but 3 or 4 years ago, it didn't change the dynamics. Everyone still started and ended wherever they were at on this thing. And this tool is good, but I think we got to figure out why that didn't work before and not repeat that mistake, because that mistake has left us burning down, another, what, since then, it must be another $6 or $7 billion we burned up, but there's about half before and half after that. It didn't do the job of helping the legislature make the hard decision to move us ahead. So I love the tool, but we need to learn from what we've done and what didn't work, because we have to do it differently this time. We have to make the decision. We need people to go down to Juneau that will actually take this one on. We can't push it off any further.
I had a conversation with former Commissioner of Revenue, Randy Hoffbeck, and he put the question to me. He said, how do you motivate a polis or a group to make a decision that costs them something in the near term to benefit them in the long term? And that's sort of the nut of what we have been working on. And I admit I've gone through some emotional ups and downs in my own considerations on that. But I think it really comes back to, and this is my thinking anyways, we're not going to get the public to a point of asking to be taxed or asking to get up their dividends. I know it's a sort of a cynical perspective. It's going to require real leadership. And what I mean by that is people who are not self-interested going down to Juneau and making hard decisions. We need people to drag us through this process. And that is, Carl, why I have cast my vote for you.
Well, thank you, Ian. And I think that sounds like a great stopping point in tonight's discussion. Both of those concluding remarks. Thank you very much. And and that's why I'm running. I am not running to have. I don't care if I get reelected or not. I'm running because of the time we're at right now. We need serious people in the room who are ready to make hard decisions. I don't favor any one particular approach to righting our fiscal ship and getting us back on the right course. I'm just going to be working hard to get us in that right direction. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Heather, who will give the concluding comments and reminders and thank yous and all that good stuff. Heather?
Hi, Carl, and everybody. Just wanted to say thank you so much. I think that this has been a really fascinating conversation. I know that there were a couple of inquiries about the presentation that Ky gave us, and we should have that available for folks who had registered. If you are attending or watching through Facebook and you had not registered, send a message to the Facebook page and we'll get a copy of that presentation to you. I do want to let you know about some upcoming opportunities. I've linked some things in the chat box. For one thing, we have some events coming up that are not only volunteer opportunities, but also opportunities where we just really need help from folks for this final push for these last 3 weeks of the campaign, or just under 3 weeks at this point. Not that I'm counting. We are having phone banks for Carl every Monday and Wednesday night, but if that time doesn't work out for you, let us know if you're interested in making calls. That direct voter contact is so important, and we need to make sure that we're reaching out to as many folks as possible between now and then. To that end, we're also doing lit drops where we're hanging information about Carl's campaign on voters' doors every Saturday. From 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And if you go to the link that I put in the chat box, you'll see where you can find information about those. We will also be having our last but not least candidate conversation event on October 29th. That will be focused on healthcare. So please come back. We'll have a new round of panelists here to discuss healthcare policy in Alaska. And also want to mention that on the 20th, next week, Tuesday, the IBEW will be hosting a fundraiser online to support Carl's campaign. Now we get to the thank yous. One, I want to thank our co-hosts. I have a full list now. We have thanks to Mark Begich, to Cliff Groh, Eric Gunderson, Ky Holland, Amber Lee, Genevieve Mina, Doug and Wendy Robbins, of course, and Jamie Rodriguez. And finally, just wanted to big thanks to our panel, Cliff Groh, Ky Holland, Ian Laing. Thank you so much for taking the time to part of this conversation. Really appreciate the words in support of Carl's campaign. And thanks to everyone for taking the time to be here tonight.
Paid for by Carl Johnson for Alaska. P.O. Box 11022, Anchorage, Alaska 99511.